Beirut, Baghdad, Paris. Where next? And what is ISIL's game plan? I'll ask the former head of counterterrorism for British intelligence, and I'll speak to a sheikh who's been described as the most influential Islamic scholar in the Western world. I'm Mehdi Hasan. He's the co-founder of the only Muslim liberal arts college in the US and a former advisor to the White House. I'll ask Sheikh Hamza Yusuf how best to take on what he calls the nut jobs of ISIL. And in the reality check, I'll challenge the lazy and dangerous view that the Middle East is in the middle of a Sunni-Shia religious war. But first, in recent weeks, ISIL has claimed responsibility for bringing down a Russian airliner, bombed Beirut, and of course attacked Paris. So is there a method to this madness? Is ISIL aching for a confrontation with the West, or is it trying to scare countries like France into backing off? To try and answer this question, I'm joined by this week's headliner from Ankara, the former head of counterterrorism for MI6 and for the United Nations, Richard Barrett. Richard Barrett, thanks for joining me on UpFront. In recent weeks, ISIL has claimed to have brought down a Russian airliner, it's bombed Beirut, and of course it's attacked Paris. What is their strategy here in your view? Are they trying to bait their enemies, the Western governments in particular, into overreacting, into sending in ground forces? Or is this them lashing out? Is this them saying, you better not come after us? Which of the two do you think it is?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think it's probably a combination of those things, and maybe more than that even, because I think one thing the Islamic State wants to do constantly is to demonstrate its power, that it can withstand attacks, that it is a real state, it's a real entity, and so on. And when being attacked by Russians, of course, not so much, but maybe a little Americans and the other coalition forces, it wants to show that it can strike back effectively. So that's one thing. But I think in doing so, not only does it take sort of revenge, which is important, but also it attracts more support to itself as people see this power and respond to it.
So it's attention-seeking in some ways?
Well, attention-seeking is one way of putting it, and I think that that idea of being the focus of attention is quite important to the Islamic State, you know, showing that nothing's going to happen in that area, or even in the world generally, without the Islamic State playing a part. I think that's quite important. And being able to bring down a Russian airplane and attack in Paris and in Beirut, and not so very long ago in Ankara as well, you know, all within a space of a few weeks, I think that that really does send a pretty strong message to many people who are thinking of supporting it or thinking of ways that they might support it, that this is a real entity that can do stuff, can really make an impact.
And do you think the French decision to intensify airstrikes against Raqqa, the so-called ISIL capital in Syria, do you think that will make France more or less of a target post-Paris?
I think inevitably it'll make it probably more of a target, if that's possible, because attacking Raqqa is certainly not going to be something that stops the Islamic State trying to attack in France. And whether it will reduce its capability to do so, I'm not sure either. So the intention will remain, capability will remain, and of course the opportunity will probably remain as well, insofar as we understand that there are many sympathizers with the Islamic State who live in France or Belgium or nearby. So I think that the bombing of Raqqa will be a sort of further engagement. And you asked earlier whether the Islamic State wanted to draw Western powers into the battle, and I think that is something that they really do want to do. You know, they talk about Dabiq being the sort of future place, the apocalyptic theory of where the end of times will begin to play out and so on. So they want people to come in there, and the French engagement, even though it's only from the air at the moment, they see as a progression towards that.
On that basis, if ISIL does want a French involvement, a Western involvement, an overreaction, shouldn't we therefore not do that? Shouldn't we not give the enemy what they want on that logic?
I think it's certainly an argument for that. But of course, you know, leaders, politicians have to respond to the immediacy of their own constituents. And certainly the French people, I think, would be surprised if President Hollande's reaction was, well, you know, we've had this dreadful attack in Paris, we shouldn't do anything about it, we just should shrug it off and carry on as normal. And of course France was already engaged in airstrikes in Syria against the Islamic State, so it would it would look like France had retreated in the face of attacks, and I don't think any nation would want to show.
But forget the politics. What's the right thing to do strategically in your view?
I think strategically, although there may not have been much option for France, I think strategically it's much better to carry on as we're doing. And the main thing to do to solve the problems created by Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is, of course, try and resolve the problems of Syria. And that requires a great deal of pressure being brought on the other players who are involved in the Syrian war, not just the Islamic State. But in reality, I think that more bombings, now there'll be by Russians as well, as Russia has confirmed that it was a bomb that brought down the Russian airliner in Sinai. I think we're going to see more attacks on the Islamic State as part, at least, of this broader strategy of trying to resolve the situation in Syria.
And is there a military strategy, a military solution which defeats ISIL and its so-called caliphate? Can we bomb our way to victory?
Well, absolutely not, no, because even if you manage to destroy the Islamic State with bombs, then what's going to take its place? At the moment, there is nothing to take its place. There is nothing, in fact, even to take Assad's place. So without something to replace what you're trying to destroy, there's actually no point in destroying it. And we saw that, of course, in Iraq, and what a mess that became. So I think that although the strategy of trying to ensure that the Islamic State doesn't do more damage than it's doing already is fine, if you like, a sort of containment strategy, and trying to decrease the amount of territory it controls is good. But unless you have a clear idea of what step 2 is, then I think taking step 1, maybe could be delayed.
You mentioned Iraq. What would you say to those people who say that you would not have this ISIL threat today? You would not have ISIL if the US and the UK had not invaded Iraq in 2003. President Obama seems to have suggested that.
Well, that's quite possible, of course. Yes, who knows what history would have been had there not been an invasion of Iraq in 2003. We can't, of course, predict that. And, we are where we are. We have to deal with the facts.
Is there a link between Iraq, the Iraq invasion, and ISIL today? Would you accept the link?
Well, there's certainly a link between the Iraq invasion and ISIS, because what began as al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003 has grown now into ISIS. There's a clear linear progression from one to the other. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who started al-Qaeda in Iraq, is, if you like, the founding father and the great hero of the current Islamic State, so-called. So there's a very, very clear link, and it never went away. Al-Qaeda in Iraq never went away from being Al-Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic State in Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq and Al-Sham, and now to the Islamic State. It's the same organization.
We hear a lot in recent days about this idea of a grey zone, of Muslims living comfortably as Muslims and as Europeans, as Americans, as Canadians. How much do you think this Paris attack in particular was about disrupting that grey zone, of sowing division within multiracial, multi-faith societies, about provoking a so-called clash of civilizations?
The whole point of terrorism, I believe really, particularly the form of terrorism we're seeing in Syria, is to force people off the fence. You have to take sides. You're either with those people or you're with us. And that polarization of society is a very important element of the Islamic State strategy. It does it, of course, in a sectarian sense between Shia and Sunni, and it's also trying to do it in a broader religious sense, community sense, between Muslims and non-Muslims. And so what happened in Paris, I think, has eroded the grey zone even more, and they will continue to do things to try and make that a narrower and narrower fence for people to be able to sit on.
The US government's own figures suggest that the number of deaths globally from terrorism has gone up by 4,500% between 2002 and 2014. Many would say that's clear evidence that the so-called war on terror has been a complete failure.
Well, indeed, yes, but then it depends what you talk about terrorism, because I think terrorism is also called insurgency, insurgency is also called terrorism. And in many states, weak states now, face these insurgent movements. And I think it's because it's come to a head in our age that people who are disaffected, they feel disadvantaged, they feel alienated from the state, now have the opportunity to bind together to do something about it, or to try to do something about it. So you see in West Africa, in East Africa, in Central Asia, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, in Middle East, of course, in North Africa, and so on. So many groups now that want to take action, and they can meet with one another, they can recruit together, helped, of course, by social media and so on, to be able to build a force which can actually do something.
But my question is, has it actually been helped by the approach of Western governments? Was the so-called war on terror the right way to go about doing things, or has it exacerbated these threats you mentioned?
Well, the war on terror, if you're talking about the war on terror as being what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, they probably have been helped ultimately by that, because it has polarized communities, yes. But if you look at it more broadly, I think you would say that weak governance, poor governance, discrimination, lack of opportunity, alienation, things like that, have done more to help terrorism. And that, of course, is a factor very much within the countries where we see terrorism today.
And is it wise, in your view right now, for France and the US and the UK and others in the West to consider an alliance with Russia against ISIL, to consider an alliance with Russia and Assad against ISIL? Is that the right way to go about defeating ISIL, in your view?
Well, I would rather doubt that, because you cannot necessarily bring all the enemies of ISIS together and say, well, that is a viable coalition. The thing is much more complicated than that. So everybody may see ISIS as a target and as something they would like to destroy, but people are doing that for different reasons. Assad because he wants to stay in power, Russia because they want more influence in the Middle East, America because it's concerned about attacks on its own interests, of course, and so on. So I think that binding together in a coalition which is identified as a coalition probably will not be a very good way to defeat ISIS. But everybody has to pull together to a certain extent, of course, against this enemy.
One last question, Richard Barrett. How long do you think this quote-unquote war against ISIL will go on? How many years?
I think it's incredibly difficult to predict that, because you could defeat ISIL. It is possible to think that you could go in there and you could just knock them out. You could weaken them so much that they would just have to go underground. But the idea that ISIL thrives on, the idea behind ISIL, I don't think it's going to be defeated anytime soon at all. That requires much more work and a much longer term, much more generational type struggle.
Richard Barrett, thanks for joining me on UpFront. What's driving all the violence and chaos in the Middle East right now? Haven't you heard? It's the age-old conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias. Well, actually, that's a myth. The truth is, it's about power, not piety, and it's a very recent phenomenon, not an ancient one. We're talking 40 years, not 14 centuries. It really all started in the late 1970s with the rise of petro-power Saudi Arabia on the Sunni side and revolutionary power Iran on the Shia side. It ramped up with the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, and it's been out of control since Bashar al-Assad went to war with his own people in Syria in 2011. So politics, politics, politics. Syria, remember, didn't start off as a sectarian conflict. It was young people protesting against abuses by security forces. It was part of the Arab Spring. Even today, the Russians, for example, aren't bombing Syria because they care about who succeeded the Prophet back in 632 AD. Meanwhile, Shia Iran backs Alawite Assad not because of long-standing theological ties, but because of geopolitics. He's their only Arab ally. After all, the Alawites were only deemed to be an offshoot of the Shias around 40 years ago. Oh, and Iran has also spent the past 2 decades backing Sunni Hamas, not just Shia Hezbollah. So much for ancient hatreds. Then there's Libya, where it's not Sunni against Shia, it's Sunni against Sunni. And of course Yemen too, where supposedly it's Sunni government forces versus Shia Houthi rebels, yet the Shias in Yemen are called Zaydis, and Zaydis aren't actually that dissimilar to Sunnis in their beliefs. As a US diplomatic cable from Yemen released by WikiLeaks pointed out, members of the two sects often pray in the same mosques and practice many of the same customs. So a lot of this Sunni-Shia conflict narrative is just a product of lazy, simplistic, cliched journalism, which not only allows a whole host of Western governments to avoid responsibility for a mess in the Middle East that they helped create, but also glosses over the fact that yes, ISIL wants to kill every Shia it can lay its hands on, but most Muslims just want to get along with each other and aren't buying into the ISIL narrative. To talk incessantly and sweepingly of a global Sunni-Shia conflict completely ignores political alliances, lifelong friendships, and yes, love stories too. The Middle East's a complicated place, and the violence there has far more to do with power grabs, identity politics, tribal splits, economic grievances, and foreign military interventions than theological differences. We're not witnessing a Sunni-Shia religious war. Well, not yet. It might well turn into an unresolvable, intractable sectarian conflict, though, if we keep treating it as if it is one. Prior Prior to the Paris attacks, I spoke with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, one of America's leading Muslim scholars, who's been at the forefront of efforts to counter the ISIL narrative and stop young Muslims in the US from going out to join what he calls the nut jobs. I began by asking him how worried he is about the allure and appeal of groups like ISIL to Muslims living in the West.
You know, I don't think their influence is anywhere near as widespread as people think it is. I think the vast majority of Muslims in the United States are very opposed to ISIS.
The FBI are pretty worried, though, of course. They say 200 Americans have gone out to fight for militant groups in Syria, including ISIL. And here in the US, between May and July of this year alone, they arrested and charged, I think, 25 people with connections to ISIL and other banned groups. In 2014, they arrested and charged 20 people over the whole year, 25 in just 3 months.
Out of over 10 million people, that's still a highly insignificant number, Mehdi, and I think you should be aware of that. There is a concern, it's a security concern, but don't forget also that some of these people are actually not going to join ISIS, but they're going to join what they consider to be a legitimate opposition in Syria. And so I think, you know, they're being lumped in as one group, but the truth is there are a lot of different factions in Syria that are fighting, and some of them are actually supported by NATO states.
Those are both very fair points. You gave a khutbah, a sermon, in September 2014 condemning ISIL, using Islamic scripture, sayings from the Prophet Muhammad, and it went viral online. Let's hear a clip from that sermon.
There's confusion. We have people in this country going overseas. It is hard to believe, but there's people going to join up, to join the Khilafah. This is a madness, complete insanity.
My question is this. Why are they going out there, the ones who are going to join ISIL? What's the reasoning in your view? Is it merely an issue of mental health, of insanity, or is it something within Islam? Is it a problem of so-called Islamist ideology, or is it a foreign policy issue, or is it young people looking for identity?
I think, Mehdi, you've summed up, I think, a lot of the factors here. Some of it is definitely mental health issues. I think there really is more mental health in a lot of these. I mean, we had a man who flew an airplane into an IRS building after writing a political screed, and yet he wasn't called a terrorist or politically motivated. He was called mentally ill. There are many examples of people doing these things in the United States, and they're always classified as mentally ill people. And yet, when Muslims do insane things, and many of these things are actually quite insane, they're categorized as terrorists. So I think we have a double standard, but undeniably there's certain people that it's been a kind of romanticized version of this idea of the caliphate and the restoration of the caliphate after its fall in 1922 or 24, depending on which time limit you're going to look at in Ottoman Turkey history. But the fact is that the group ISIS emerged as a response to a lot of the Shia atrocities of militia against Sunni villagers.
And yet, at the same time, as you say yourself, there is a romanticization of this ideology of a caliphate. There is clear sectarian hate. They're not just killing Shias, they're killing Christians, they're killing Yazidis. How do you tackle that core ideological bent for some of these fighters out there?
You have two factors here. One of them is a takfiri ideology, this idea of anathematizing Muslims, of considering Muslims to be outside of the faith. That's one issue. Then you have this provincialism, this attitude towards Christians and Jews and Yazidis and other peoples that Muslims historically have lived in peace with and protected and preserved their churches, their synagogues. This is one of the first times in Muslim history where these atrocities have been committed against religious minorities. So the idea that this has something to do with normative Islam is not acceptable. But as you know, we're living at a time when Islam is whatever anybody who wants to says it is. This is the kind of nominalist attitude that a lot of modern people have. I don't think we can say completely that it has nothing to do with Islam. Obviously, these people are motivated by scripture, which is clear in their publications and things like that. But again, it's a type of Protestantism, and I'm not talking about modern Protestantism. I'm talking about when the Protestants revolted against Catholic tradition. This created the religious wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. You have a lot of people opening the Quran, finding verses in there that can be decontextualized or completely misunderstood, just like you can in the Bible. And these are, unfortunately, these are the realities of the age that we're living in.
You mentioned Protestants and the revolt of the 17th century, 18th century. I mean, many critics of Islam say that Islam needs to undergo a reformation. You sound like you're saying it's already in the middle of a reformation, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, we are in this is the Reformation. These people that say Islam needs a reformation have never read Christian history. This is the Reformation. What we need is a Council of Trent. We need a counter-reformation. These are the reformists. This is the fruit of Reformation.
Can you have a counter-reformation in which you don't go after, you mentioned Takfiri ideology, others call it a violent Salafist ideology. Many people say it's the Saudi brand of Islam. Can you have that counter-reformation without scholars such as yourself being willing to come out and take on the beliefs and the scholars behind those beliefs, from which groups like ISIL draw comfort?
You have to have scholars that are really deeply rooted in the Islamic tradition. We're not living in the pre-modern times. We're living in a completely different period, and it's not reforming or changing Islam. It's actually taking the tools of the religious tradition and revitalizing them. So in that way, it's renewal, which our Prophet talked about, renovation, what's called tajdeed in the Arabic language. So we need renovation, which is not to destroy the house and rebuild a new house, but to restore the dereliction of the house, to restore it so that it's functioning. That you turn on the faucets and water comes out. You flush the toilet. There's a lot of toilets need to be flushed.
I want to play another clip from that sermon of yours from September 2014.
The people of knowledge have no voice anymore. It's just all these young boys out there on Google. That's who now rules this religion. Young boys.
Isn't the problem, Sheikh Hamza, that you're not getting through to that particular group of young men and women who are tempted by an extremist narrative, a Takfiri narrative, a Salafist narrative, whatever you want to call it?
Well, Mehdi, part of the problem is that there are so many egregious wrongs in the Muslim world. And I know people don't like to hear this card, the grievance card. But the reality of it is, if you go online, you can watch the types of videos where atrocities are committed against Muslims on an almost daily basis, and nobody speaks up against it. There's a lot of young people that really feel incredibly frustrated, and if we don't find healthy means by which they can express some type of outrage in a way that's productive, conducive to civil society, to actually redress some of the wrongs that are out there. If they don't find ways to do that, there are people, demagogues and others out there that will manipulate the emotions of youth. People are frustrated.
You talk about frustration. I want to ask you about something else, another aspect of frustration. Is it true that you said at a recent seminar here in Washington, D.C., that guys who turn to violence do so because they're sexually frustrated? That the real reason they decide to get involved in terrorism is because they, quote, are watching pornography 24 hours a day. Were you really being serious there?
You know, look, I said that with some hyperbole. But the truth is, I think I have something which I call the defilement theory of terrorism. And I think that some of these men definitely do. They go to the West, they sow their wild oats, they get this kind of realization that they've been tainted, polluted, and then they have this born-again experience. This is, I think, more common than people realize.
There is undoubtedly a great deal of Islamophobia in the West, in the United States. And at the same time, surely you'd accept that a lot of Americans switch on the TV, watch the news, they see the headlines, they see groups in Nigeria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Iraq, in Syria, beheading and butchering innocent women and children in the name of Islam. The biggest group calls itself the Islamic State. Surely you'd accept that poses a PR problem, at the very minimum, for Muslims living in America.
Malcolm X in 1964 said the Muslims are suffering from a major public relations problem. He said that in the autobiography. And I would say, look, all those things are true, but remember, 1 out of every 4 people on this planet, Mehdi, is a Muslim. We represent 1.6 billion people and rising. You cannot take these statistically insignificant numbers out there and extrapolate from that somehow Islam is an evil religion. The Ku Klux Klan at one point had over 5 million members. The Ku Klux Klan was a Christian terrorist organization in the United States that terrorized African Americans. So people have to put things in perspective, and I really think that people fail to put these things into perspective, my friend.
Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, thanks for joining me on UpFront. That's our show. UpFront will be back in the new year.